Hello everyone, it's good to see you. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Need for Speed Unbound, developed by Criterion Games. The game came out in I think late 2020. It's still pretty recent of a release. I got to tell you a little bit about my history first with the Need for Speed series, especially since this is the 25th installment in the whole franchise. I'm a big fan of Need for Speed. I really enjoy racing games, but I also enjoy some of the aspects of the series that make it interesting from the lens of, just being a casual enjoyer of racing. There was a time when racing games, and I think you see this a lot still with more clean-cut professional racing games, where it was either one of two things. You have all these tracks and track cars, or you have street racing, but the street racing takes place in the form of, you're driving the most powerful, fastest, craziest looking car that could ever exist at the time the games were developed. And when Ghost Games came along, which I believe now is EA Gothenburg, back in the mid 2010s, and they kind of took Need for Speed Rivals and Need for Speed 2015 and Heat. And I really liked what they did with it, because from the lens of focusing on street racing, the culture thereof, it was really fun that I could frickin' buy a Honda Civic and go tune that out and make it all crazy, because as just a normal person doing normal things and enjoying normal racing culture, etc. That's a car that I could see myself having owned at one point. I actually did have an Accord at some point, and I love the old school boxy Honda look. And I grew up watching things like Initial D, so of course I'm going to be a fan of that. And I really appreciated what Ghost did with those games, especially in Need for Speed 2015 and Heat. I think they had really capitalized on many of the aesthetics that make racing and cars and car culture very enjoyable, whether that's from the customization and the expression of oneself through the look of their car, or the lack of a look of their car, all the way to the art and the music and etc. And I think this game really amps up some of those aspects, and we'll dive into that. But I did want to mention, it was interesting that Criterion's taken this back over, because for a long time they were at the helm of this series, especially with some of the biggest release titles, like Most Wanted is one that comes to mind. And, they have a lot of experience making racing games. I think one of the disappointing aspects of that specifically is that EA Gothenburg has now been, I would say, demoted to working on Battlefield 2042 as kind of an additional support role, which is very disappointing, because I really liked what they were doing with this series and where it was going. And so the big question for me becomes, on the development aspects of this game, how did Criterion live up to the expectation that that Ghost Games had created within me for playing one of these new Need for Speed games? And so we'll start at the top with the story. I mean, the story here is kind of straightforward. You are a guy or gal, and you work at a place called Rydell Rides, and you have a friend, Yaz, who works there, and y'all are like a close-knit kind of family, in like a Fast Five kind of way, or Fast and Furious, whatever you want to call it. And you do races, and Yaz has a friend named Alec, and Alec kind of puts Yaz on to doing car deliveries. But these are kind of like sussy-wussy, right? So you always get the cops after you. And one night, when the player picks up one of these cars, Yaz is nowhere to be found. You don't hear from anybody, and you go back to Rydell's Rides, and then it turns out Alec and his gang have stolen all the cars. And Yaz is there, and of course she says, I wasn't a part of that. Yeah, okay, because you're not suspicious, just happening to be there with all the other people stealing these cars. And she leaves. And then kind of 2 years go by, and the mayor of the city is really interested in cleaning up street racing and getting off the streets reasonably so, because the races in this game seem like they would genuinely be murdering civilians if it was happening in real life. Um, but yeah, so street racing's died down a little bit, and you, as the player, are kind of working as an Uber driver, and you go pick up somebody, and they say, "Oh yeah, we want to get back into the street racing thing. I'll just give you some money to buy a car, and you go start doing races." And you do the races, and Yaz announces a big grand finale, and then you have the chance to, build yourself up to race Yaz and win back the car that she took from you when you and her were working on that car together. And there's a couple little plot points that kind of twist and turn here, I guess, in some ways, the plot. But overall, I would say, from a story lens, this is about as card game story as you're going to get. I mean, I feel like I've heard this story a few times in a few iterations, and so nothing too crazy there overall. But it does pilot the game along, and in an interesting way, I would say. When we look at this from kind of just a structural aspect, the game takes place over the course of 4 weeks. And so every day you'll have racing events, and every night you'll have racing events. And I guess in this way, I think about it kind of like Persona, because you have day to day, you're kind of building up and advancing your characters. And at the end of each week, there's a qualifier event. And if you win those, then you will go on to the next week and the next week to eventually kind of get yourself in that hierarchy to face Yaz. But before we dive into many of the gameplay aspects outside of that, I want to talk on the sound and kind of the look and style of this game. When we talk about the sound, was a huge fan of the soundtrack of this game. I mean, every song in it really feels contemporary and exciting and modern, and like you're really there in the action, enjoying the racing. And the cars sound pretty good. And there's ways that you can customize the way your car sounds, either when it's shifting or the noise just kind of being generated by the engine and the exhaust. And all of these aspects of the game I found to be very fun and enjoyable from a customization sense, and also just a playable sense. So in a lot of ways, the world itself is alive with music and sound, and I found that to be really enjoyable, I have to say. And as far as the graphics go and the art style goes, I think the game looks really great, realistic, and depending on the way in which you're looking at your car, very cool. And Criterion has taken this and paired it with an art style that's kind of cel shaded and has like graffiti art, and I think really speaks and expresses a vision for what the game studio really thinks about street racing, and especially in the lens of making this game. And I think the world's also been designed very nicely from the lens of it, heavily inspired by the Chicago area. And whether you're in the city or you're up in the mountains, I think the game just looks really well, runs really well, and I had a good experience playing it on, of course, the PlayStation 5. And so all's well in the sound world, the looks world. I think where the contentions kind of come in for me is mostly on the gameplay sense, because similarly the game controls really well and is comfortable to play. But how's the game structured? I think that's where the real question comes in. So what happens is you want to buy a car, right? In the game, the first handful of cars you're really going to want start to get into like the 60, 70, 80,000 range. And so when you initially start the game, of course, you have no money, and the events that you're competing in aren't netting you a whole lot of cash either. And so what this means is that in the first week or so of the game, you're really scraping by, you're doing every event you can, and trying to upgrade your car so you can place higher and higher in the races. And so the first week itself is a very long draw of you attempting to build up your car and kind of get there. And at the same time, you're competing for what is in the game called the heat system. And the heat system was something first kind of shown off in Need for Speed Heat. And it creates an interesting risk reward. Well, let's talk about it from the Need for Speed Heat lens. It creates an interesting risk reward wherein every time you compete in an event, you get to choose the events, of course, and they all have a heat associated with them. So from 0 to 5, kind of like, think Grand Theft Auto 5 stars, a race may net you 1.5 heat or 0.5. And so what you're trying to do is say, okay, for this amount of money I'm going to get from the race, I'm going to get this amount of heat on my character and unwanted attention from the police, which, you know, if they then spot you, then you're in a chase, and there's a risk that if they crash you and bust you, you're going to lose everything that you had for that day. And the game does pretty well at ensuring you abide by that, in terms of you can't just quit out of the game and try again and things like that. And so I think that it's really interesting from the Need for Speed Heat side, because as the heat increases, the amount of cash you're going to get multiplies. So if you have 2 or 3 heat, you might get 2 or 3 times the cash. And so risk reward, it creates this really interesting question for the player of, okay, how far can I push this, and how much money can I rake in on a certain day or night, without, you know, facing the fear of losing it all, because the police are in this game incredibly aggressive and crazy. And from this lens, you know, that being a big part of the game, Need for Speed Unbound kind of trips. And what I mean by that is, you still have the heat system, you still have that risk reward of, should I stay out and keep doing this? However, the multiplier's been taken away. And so what that means is that if you are at 5 heat and there's freaking helicopters and monster truck, like jacked Ford F-150s coming after you and driving over mountains and flying through the air to get your car, you're not getting anything out of that. In fact, when these races end, these chases end, you get maybe a couple $1,000s, and when you're late stage in the game, a couple $1,000s is, well, just to put in perspective, I think the late stage cars, the supercars, are like $3 million. And so because there's nothing multiplying on top of all the money you're getting in, this aspects of the game becomes more of a nuisance than it becomes a question for the player, in terms of engagement and in terms of creating a risk, but also, you know, giving them the opportunity to strategize and say, well, maybe it is right that I go home because my car is just not up to snuff to face, you know, police at this tier, etc. And so I did kind of find that disappointing from the lens of, they become more of a blockade towards progress than they do become a gameplay mechanic you want to engage with. And of course, the police street racer aspect of a street racing game, that relationship is really important to make interesting, because most of these stories in games face that authority and have to do with the police chasing you, etc. So I did find that disappointing as compared to Need for Speed Heat. And if you're not comparing it on its own, I think it still is more tedious than it is an interesting mechanic in this game specifically. If I could change that, I would say, okay, if you have a concern about people getting too much money, you know, cut down the amount of winnings, but then do apply that multiplier. You know, the average person might take 3 heat and then they'll go home. Well, make sure that for 3 heat they're getting enough money to reasonably progress in the game. But for players who want to take that risk, well, then you create an environment where they can be rewarded for having that experience. Another thing that happens is that each week is kind of built for you to reach a new tier of vehicle. And so by the end of the first week, it's expected you'll have an A rank vehicle, and 2 an A plus, and 3 an S, and 4 all of your cars combined, A plus, S plus, will face off in the final grand challenge. And what Criterion's done is, when you build the performance options for your car, you'll get to a point where you upgrade your garage, or your vehicle is at the cusp of A plus to S, so on and so forth. And the game just completely stonewalls you and says, you're not allowed to progress your car any further because you haven't gotten to the next week. And I thought this was um, an interesting game design piece, because what it means is, by the time you finish the first week, if you've been playing it as most people would, which is you go out and you win races and you get money, and once the heat is too high, you turn around, go home, and then you go to the next evening or day or whatnot. Um, by the time you finish your first week, you'll have so much leftover money from winning cars and winning races that when you buy your new car at the max of its tier, literally the day one, you will have already maxed out the entire vehicle. And so again, you play the full week, winning first on all the races because you're just OP compared to any of the AI, and you aren't able to do anything interesting with that money because you can't upgrade your car. And so I did find this aspect of the game to incentivize the player to say, okay, well, how about I just skip this day? And I just skip the day and go to the next day. I mean, the most reasonable thing to do is if you want to have full access to the game and its experience and the various upgrade, different tiers of cars, etc., you would get to the week where you've unlocked S+, because in that week you can play with vehicles of all tiers because you still have missions of all tiers. And then you'll be winning races that are netting you a ton of money and you have everything unlocked. And so I found it weird because for me it creates this aspect, that criterion is saying, hey, don't play our game, just skip through the content and then get to the end, and that's going to make for a great racing experience. And so again, when I compare that to Need for Speed Heat, I felt like Heat really kind of had more of a freedom to it to do the game. And maybe they did something similar in Heat. I don't honestly remember too well the mechanics of upgrading and whether there were stone walls there. But in Unbound here, it's very prevalent, and it's something that really sticks in my mind. And so I found that to be kind of frustrating. One thing I was mentioning just now too, in terms of difficulty, the game only stays difficult to the extent your car is in line with the other vehicles and racers you're facing. And there's a lot of variance between the low tier and the high tier performers in these races. But Criterion always leaves a little gap in which you can upgrade your car to a point where you're going to beat them. And the AI acts very interesting. The rubber banding's not too bad, but one thing I noticed is that when cornering, the AI in the game is very, very conservative in the sense of they brake very soon, they go super slow, get around the corner, and then they take off. And so most drivers, not even aggressively, are going to find themselves just crushing racers in a corner race, right? However, if it's like a full stretch where you're on the interstate or whatnot, they're infallible. It's really hard for them to not just fly by any car, not hit an obstacle, and just punch it all the way to the end. And so I found that the difficulty can really kind of scale depending on the type of race you're in. And so those variances there can't necessarily be addressed by different vehicles, whereas you'll find it in different races. There's drift races where you need like specific cars with a certain type of differential or tires, and then you have takeover races where the goal is to earn points by smashing things and etc. And so I did find the game fun, but I did find myself quite overpowered throughout most of the experience, and so unfortunately kind of easy in that lens. But otherwise, I think the game is really fun from a customization aspect. It's just so fun to buy cars, to make them look the way you want, to customize the design of them, etc. And you can do that for your player character here too, which I thought was cool. It was kind of fun that you have a player character that you can design, etc. I don't think that was in Heat. And so from a customization lens, I did really enjoy the game, and I thought it was a lot of fun. And this is one where I'm really torn because I feel like the structure of the game was, there was some improvements necessary, but the actual aspects of driving and racing the game were very exciting. And so I think the only other place where it kind of hinders is just the amount of content for the length of the game is kind of mismatched. I think most people, if they play the game in a reasonable way, will spend 30 hours on this experience. But the variation of races is not too high. You'll spend a lot of time doing the same race over and over and over and over again. And unfortunately, what that means is that to do that experience for 30 hours, it really starts to feel kind of drawn out and like a little much. And I really think that, and similar for the customization, right? I bought a lot of cars that were fantastic, or you buy supercars. Supercars don't have as many customization features, etc. And so you really kind of find yourself in a place of, okay, I have all this money. I'm crushing everybody out there. I'm doing the same race over and over and over again. What am I getting from this experience further? I just want to beat it at this point. And it's kind of where I got when I was playing the game. And so that's a bit unfortunate, I would say. But aesthetically, again, I just think the game is so cool and so fun. So I'm really torn. I probably won't return to this title for a replay. I will just kind of wait it out and see what the next Need for Speed has to offer. But I think it's worth checking out if you have enjoyed where the Need for Speed series has been in recent years. I think you're going to get a lot of fun out of this still. And a lot of fun was what I got. It's just, I think that there's like a common pattern where people who play a game, they say, I played this game for 10,000 hours and I hate it and here's why. I think that the game just stays a little too long for what's offered and kind of fumbles some of the core mechanics that I think make, especially the more recent titles of Need for Speed, interesting. And so check it out. It's really cheap. I think I picked it up only for like $15. And so at that price, you get well worth your money. And I think it's worth checking out. I had a lot of critiques in here. Interesting to hear what you all think. You know, did you play Need for Speed Unbound? Did you have a similar experience? Very curious to know. But ultimately, you know, whether we agree or not, I really appreciate tuning in and hearing my thoughts. And if you like the video, please like the video, and I hope you subscribe to stick around for more. Until then, it was great speaking with you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.